Y'all ready? Okay, so first off, first slide is wrong. I am no longer these things. I'm 5 years departed from this position, but this is what I was, where I was from 2004 to 2013, or 2017, excuse me, at NASA Johnson Space Center, which is literally about a mile away from where I'm at now, which is the University of Houston, Clear Lake. So we're down on the south side of Houston. I worked in a laboratory. It was called the Exercise Physiology and Countermeasures Laboratory. And basically our work was kind of divided into two broad bins. One was doing pre and post-flight testing, physiologic testing of the astronauts. Primarily, we were looking at muscle strength. We did VO2 max tests, assessing, cardiovascular or aerobic capacity. And then the other big bin was research, the countermeasures side. So we were looking at hardware, exercise protocols, things like that to better protect skeletal muscle performance, et cetera, during space flight. So I really enjoyed getting to do both of those things because it was a lot of research, which I love, but then it was also some more operational type stuff where you're literally, testing these crew members, within a day of them returning from their flights, and then obviously a pre-flight test before them. Is it gonna, there we go. All right, physiologic effects of spaceflight. You guys know well, there are a myriad of effects, I would dare say, on almost every system in the body. These are some of the very common ones that are studied by, I'm going to keep saying our lab, the lab I was formerly in, I still collaborate with, that our lab studied. And then there were adjacent labs as well. We had a bone lab. There's a sensory motor or a neuro lab. There's a cardiovascular lab. So all these labs, we collaborate, but at the same time, they're kind of testing and researching things specific to that physiologic system. So the things I'm going to be focusing on are mostly kind of here under the skeletal muscle heading. I guess some cardiovascular, and that we're looking at things like aerobic capacity as well. So also, not to insult y'all's intelligence, but the key thing here with spaceflight is obviously the lack of mechanical loading. And I really like that term, mechanical loading. You hear unweighting, you hear disuse, terms like that, and those are fine. But what I really like this because it focuses on the physics, okay? And one of the things I've kind of crystallized in my head from the years I was at JSC was that, as a physiologist, is this phrase: physics drives physiology. And when we're here on Earth, we take the physics for granted because we're in a constant 1G environment. And so we can obviously alter physical parameters like load, have people lift weights with greater loads. We can have them lift weights at higher velocities, things like that. And those change, the biomechanics and thus the physiologic adaptation, say, of an exercise program. But when you go to space, you've changed the fundamental, environment, the fundamental nature of the physics, which is to say there's no constant load. You have mechanical unloading, and that leads to all of those, I'll call them physiologic maladaptations that you see, or that you saw in that previous slide. So we got to do something to counteract that. We don't want people floating around for even a few weeks, but certainly not for 6 months on the International Space Station, and very definitely not for several years on a Mars mission. So from as far back as Skylab, okay, here we go. Oh man, y'all won't hear the music, do you? Here, I'm gonna throw it into the big mode and see if it plays here. Bummer. It has some really funny calliope music that, you know, sounds like something you hear on Saturday morning cartoons. So this is on Skylab. These were the earliest attempts at exercise countermeasures. This is back in the 70s. So the first, I'll play it through one more time when this ends. I mean, you can see here, this is a treadmill, and some of the fundamental components are still the same, which is a harness. That's really important. You know, if you don't have a harness, I'll just let it run while I talk. Oops. There you go. If you don't have a harness while you run on a treadmill in 0G, well, you can imagine what happens. You just float across the cabin. So we still use something. We don't use a slick plate and socks, because that probably makes your feet get really hot pretty fast. It also doesn't really encourage good running form, but the fundamentals are there. Load the subject with a harness, bungee cords, or some kind of a loading system, such that when they go to run, they're having to, you know, raise their mass, in effect, in this case, against an external load. So this slide is getting increasingly out of date. How many of you know what this device is? Do y'all recognize this?
Is that like a Bowflex?
Good, very good. Okay, maybe they still have some infomercials on out there. So probably, I think about 20 years ago, Bowflex was the hot thing. And also 20 years ago, the internet was pretty tame and not very frequented. And so it's kind of a joke, but it's really true. Exercise equipment was often sold on late night infomercials, you know, and they would have some buff guy or some hot chick that, you know, was telling you why you should send them 4 payments of $19.95 to buy their device, you know, but wait, if you order in the next 30 minutes, we'll knock off 1 payment, you know, that kind of thing. And Bowflex was really popular. So I remember starting in 2004 at NASA, and a lot of people saying, well, why don't you just send a Bowflex up there? And the funny thing was that actually was not a bad idea. And the device that we used almost 20 years ago was actually quite similar to a Bowflex. So we called it the Interim Resistive Exercise Device, or IRED. Everything has an acronym. And this is IRED. And basically inside of these 2 cylinders that you see, they had a piston, and then they had rubber discs. So basically, as this guy squats or stands up from the squat, what he's doing is he pulls on those cables as he's twisting these rubber discs. And so he's having to stretch the rubber inside, ergo he gets resistance. Okay. Some of the, well, I'll go into the problems with IRED in a second. So this is what we were seeing in terms of strength loss early in ISS. This is talking like 2000 through 2008, maybe, when we did an isokinetic knee extensor, knee flexor test. So basically measuring the strength of your quadriceps and the strength of your hamstring muscles. We were seeing about a 14% loss in quadriceps strength and almost a 20% loss in hamstring flexor, knee flexor strength, which, you know, we kind of thought that's not very good. You know, we probably should aim to do better than that. These are over like six-month flights. So we began doing some research early in the 2000s, working into 2010, even 2015. And this is where I'm going to say I'm going to make things a little more narrative instead of going through a whole bunch of studies. These are things that we learned that matter for protecting skeletal muscle in spaceflight. There are three things. One is probably the most obvious: absolute load. You need a good absolute load. And so I'm going to put some numbers to that in a second. The second thing that you need is good eccentric loading. So if I use the term concentric contraction and eccentric contraction, do you guys know what that means? Okay, I didn't see enough head nods, so I'm gonna explain real quick. So when you're doing a squat, we're going to talk about the quadriceps. When he stands up, his quadriceps are contracting concentrically. So if you feel or look at your quads as you stand up from a squat, that muscle is tightening, it's shortening, okay? But when he squats back down, what happens to that quadricep muscle as he squats down and bends his knees? It stretches. The quadricep muscle stretches. And importantly, it's still exerting force during that stretch, okay? And you can all imagine that. Like if you have a bar on your back and you go to squat, but you're like, yeah, I'm just gonna fall down, or I'm just gonna drop down. Well, guess what happens? You end up on your butt on the floor in the gym, you know, with a bar on your head. So we understand you have to exert a force even when you descend in the squat. That's an eccentric contraction. Interestingly, although eccentric contractions are easier, that is to say we're stronger eccentrically than we are concentrically, the eccentric contraction is really important for muscle growth, for muscle strength, and for protection during spaceflight. And then the third thing I'm going to show you is the force curve that is developed during a lift. And this is due to inertial effects, okay? Again, think about when we squat with a bar here on Earth, gravity is a given, okay? We can't escape it. And we kind of don't think about it, but the speed on Earth, the inertial effects you generate based on the velocity or the speed with which you squat is really important to the forces that are generated. So back kind of like what I was just saying, imagine if you've got a 100-pound bar on your back and you're squatting. If you squat down very slowly, you know, maybe take 3, 4, 5 seconds to go down. If I measured the force generated at your feet, it'd probably be pretty close to 100 pounds plus your body weight, okay? If, in contrast, you did that really rapid drop down, you would see the forces be very low, most of your descent, and then at the bottom, it's time to pay the piper. And you're gonna have to generate a really high force to decelerate and stop that bar from crushing you into the floor. And what you're gonna see is a huge spike, a very high force, even though it's your same body, same 100-pound bar, but now you've got an inertial effect, the acceleration of that mass, you and the bar, due to gravity and the fact that you didn't exert a muscular force to slow it. So you see what I'm talking about? Physics, same bar, same body, but due to, in this case, velocity movement velocity being different, you end up with very different forces generated. Those forces that you generate are really important to how the muscle adapts. And to bring it back to spaceflight, this device with its stretchy rubber resistance did not allow for very high absolute load. It provided very poor eccentric loading. Think about a rubber cord. You stretch it on the way up, that takes, you know, a decent bit of force. Then on the way down, it's helping you. It wants to recoil. So the resistance on the eccentric is very low. And then there's no inertial effects because you're not accelerating a mass, you're stretching a band, okay? And I'm going to show you some numbers to that. So the peak load for IRED was 136 kilos. That's about 300 pounds, okay? And you might think, oh, that's actually a lot of weight. I mean, I can't squat 300 pounds. But remember, in spaceflight, the first thing you have to do is replace your body weight. Because here, you know, you do a body weight squat, it's like, well, okay, at least I'm squatting, you know, whatever I weigh. But up there, a body weight squat is Zero. There's no body weight. So let's take an astronaut who weighs 90 kilos, that's 200 pounds. Say this is a guy. Well, 90 kilos of this 136 is him just replacing his body weight. That's a zero effort squat. So he's only got 46 kilos, which is about 100 pounds, additional loading, which is not much. So bottom line, IRED provided very low loading for astronauts. The eccentric load for free weights, we would say the eccentric load is 100% of the concentric load. It's the same, in other words, whatever you lift up, it's coming down because it's a fixed mass. With IRED, the eccentric loading was about 70% that of the concentric, so less than the concentric, which is a bad thing, as we learned. And as I just said, IRED had no inertial component. So here's a force curve. So this is a squat on, making sure I'm reading right. Yeah, this is the free weight squat on top. These data were recorded on Earth, in our lab. But this is like the top of the squat, and then this is all the way down to the bottom of the squat, and then back up. And then the dark black squiggly line is the force. Okay. And remember, I said even though you've got a fixed mass on your back, inertial components will alter the actual force that's generated at your feet. So that's where this is measured, is at the feet of the lifter. So here's them at the beginning. They begin going down, down, down in the squat, and the load goes up. And where's the peak load in the squat? It's at the bottom, okay? So at the bottom, you have to decelerate the load that's coming down to crush you, and then you have to re-accelerate it in the opposite direction. And then you notice as you get it going, sorry, my mouse may be not matching my words. As you get the mass going up, as you ascend in your squat, the force you're having to put out is actually going down due to momentum. You're getting that mass moving, okay? Here is an IRED squat. And I don't have to talk through the whole thing. This is the eccentric load, you going down in the squat, and then at the bottom, this is you going up in the squat. And you notice the shape, the eccentric load is lower, and maybe as or more importantly, the entire shape and the presence of a peak is absent in the IRED squat. So this could be, exhibit 1 in Physics Drives Physiology, and IRED did not elicit similar, protection adaptations in the skeletal muscle as we would expect, for instance, from a free weight here on Earth. So off we went to design a new device. And I kind of touched on this at the beginning, but this to me was one of the fun things about working there, is you got a problem, so you start working on a solution. And it's not just you, we're working with engineering, had a whole team. What can we do to build a device that overcomes the shortcomings of IRED? So ARED, the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, was designed and built 2006, 7, 8. I think it was deployed on station late 2008 or early 2009. And its resistance, instead of coming from elastic, it's coming from vacuum cylinders. So if you look at this picture, this is the vacuum cylinder, and it you can't see the whole picture, but as you lift, it would plunge up and down like a piston inside a covered cylinder. So this is a vacuum cylinder with the cover off. Here it is over here in the CAD drawing with the cover on. So picture, it looked like that, but this is kind of opening it up so you can see the inside. But as you lifted, that piston moved up and down, and you're literally pushing and pulling against a vacuum, a constant resistance, just like you would have with a weight on your back. You could alter, now the vacuum resistance was constant. So how would we change the load? Well, clever engineers figured, okay, what we'll do is we'll turn this dial, we'll change the length of the lever arm for the lifter. So a light load moved the weight stack, or not the weight stack, sorry, moved the vacuum cylinder pistons closer to you, so you had a long lever arm and it made it feel easy because you had a long lever arm to move those pistons. Whereas you could dial it the other way, it would bring the lever arm in shorter, so your mechanical advantage was reduced and it made the resistance feel harder. Okay. So, and you can kind of see out here, here's the bar, and you could do pretty much any exercise that you do on Earth, you could do here. You could squat, you could deadlift, you could press, overhead press, bench press, you name it. You could do a whole myriad of exercises. ARED doubled the maximum loading capacity we had on IRED. So it would load up to 600 pounds. The eccentric loading was almost 100%, was greater than 90%, that of the concentric load. And it also included an inertial component, which I didn't show you guys. These red flywheels, and you see them pointed to here, they're red in the CAD drawing, but they're these silver discs here. These were in line with the piston moving through the vacuum cylinder. If you lifted slowly, the pistons would, or sorry, the flywheels would rotate slowly. If you lifted and moved the weight rapidly, they would spin rapidly. And what this meant was when it came time to change directions, the velocity of those flywheels exerted an inertial effect. So if they were moving slowly, it was really easy to stop and squat in the opposite direction. But if you had dropped quickly, those flywheels were spinning, and oh, you could feel the need to decelerate them and then re-accelerate them in the opposite direction. So we basically engineered inertia into it via a flywheel. It's kind of like a yo-yo, like it's spinning, and then you have to reverse its movement. Okay, we did that. So this is just a little, and you can probably find better ones now on YouTube. This is Chris Hadfield, Canadian astronaut, who's a really good speaker, by the way. You got to look up some of his stuff on YouTube. He's a really cool guy, great communicator. This is him deadlifting on the station. One of the things you notice is that it looks like the whole ARED machine is moving. It is. And the reason is because, this is a sidebar, but you can't bolt something like this onto the wall of the station, because what's going to happen when you lift? You know, you're imparting forces into the station. What's going to happen? It's going to move. Like, you'll spin the station or get the solar arrays flapping, you know, with resonance. And so exercise equipment, anything that you're pushing on, pulling on, imparting a force to, it has to be what they call vibration isolated. That was him squatting, by the way, at the end. And vibration isolated simply means it's on a shock system or a strut system, so that it kind of floats with the station and it never pushes against the station. So it's kind of floating itself. All right, I got to speed up. So we did a study on the ground with ARED, comparing it to free weights before we flew it. Basically, we knew, you know, we're going to fly this thing, but we want to see, at least on Earth, how does it compare to free weights? Because we know free weights elicits really potent and beneficial effects, increases muscle mass, increases strength. If you train with it. So we wanted to see how does ARED compare to that, with the thought that if ARED compared favorably, it'll probably do reasonably well in space. So we had a group train for 16 weeks using ARED, and we had another group train for 16 weeks using free weights. Same identical program. They did 3 exercises. They did squat, heel raise, and deadlift, focusing on lower body and the back, because those are the muscles that are mostly affected by spaceflight. We see very little change in mass and strength of the upper body because it's not as big of a change for the upper body, unless you're, I don't know, maybe a bodybuilder or something like that. For most of us, our arms do things like pick up pencils and books and cups, and so going to space is not such a big change for the arms. So this is looking at increases in, make sure I'm saying this. Yeah. So this is looking at percent increase in muscle volume of the thigh and of the calf for these 2 groups, the ARED groups in blue, free weight groups in red. So you can see both of them statistically improved, like thigh mass, or thigh volume, I should say. This is MRI. And there was no, even though it was like 10% to 7%, there was no statistical difference between the groups. This is using DEXA, so the scale is probably not as easy to see a change, but there was about a 1 kilogram increase in muscle mass for both groups from pre to post. So, and no difference between groups, so that was good. And then we saw similar with our a 1RM, so it's maximum, how much weight can you lift one time, with the ARED group and the free weight group. This had 3 time points. So this is their pre-value, this is their mid-value, 8 weeks in the study, this is their post-value, 16 weeks. And you can see, for all 3 exercises, both groups improved, and then they did a lot of improvement in the first 8 weeks, and then a little bit of improvement in the second 8 weeks, pretty much for all 3 exercises. Again, no differences between the groups. So this gave us, pretty good confidence that ARED was going to be a decent device, and that's proved to be so. So I showed you all this column of astronauts who flew using IRED, and they were losing 14 to 20% strength. We basically halved those losses using ARED for crew members that use ARED. So they went down to losing 7% and 11% in those quadricep muscle strength and hamstring muscle strength. So it's not perfect protection, it's not full protection, but it's much better. I'm going to just briefly touch on bed rest, less to talk about a bunch of data, but more just to kind of introduce the idea. By the way, physicians have a huge component in these type of studies, bed rest studies, as you can imagine, because you're putting someone inpatient in a bed, and they're like, one of our studies, the last one I'm going to just mention, it was 10 weeks long in bed, 70 days of head down tilt bed rest. By the time you had the pre and the post, they were with us for, I think it was about 3.5 months. So there was tons of medical oversight for that study. And I think, the physicians, as I recall, I think they really enjoyed that, that analog of bed rest as something, that they were certainly a key component of that team. So bed rest, obviously the purpose of it in a research environment is to simulate the mechanical unloading of spaceflight. You can't remove gravity, but you can remove, both the activity of walking and such against gravity, but you're also removing, importantly, and it's the reason it's 6-degree head down tilt, you're removing the typical gravitational vector that is going from your head down through your axial spine towards your feet. And now the gravitational vector is this way, like through your chest. What ends up happening, the reason it's 6-degree head down tilt, all of your fluid, not all, there is a headward fluid shift that occurs with 6-degree head down bed rest that is very similar to what happens in spaceflight. You remove gravity in spaceflight, there's a fluid shift up to the chest, to the head. The body senses that, and its response is a systemic diuresis. you pee out about 15% of your blood volume. Your plasma volume decreases by about 10 to 15% in 2 or 3 days. It's very quick. And you can imagine this has effects on things like blood pressure. It has effects on things like aerobic capacity, because you now have lower blood volume. You have less venous return, to the heart to stimulate stroke volume, to stimulate cardiac output. So this is a good example of the cascading effect of removing one seemingly simple thing, but it leads to a lot of shifts. So bed rest is a very good analog to study these effects on Earth. I used to say to study it cheaply, and it is much cheaper than studying things in spaceflight, but it ain't cheap. You're paying these subjects a lot. They're inpatient in a hospital with physicians, nursing. These are very expensive studies to conduct. And we spent about 10 years solid doing bed rest studies, one after the other after the other. One of the big studies we did was to look at high intensity exercise. So I'm going to talk about a little about countermeasures. What we have them do. I've talked about devices. This is more focused on the protocol. So historically, astronauts have done a much more high volume, low intensity exercise program, both for their aerobic exercise and for their resistance exercise. And a lot of the reason for that, honestly, was because of the hardware. Like I just showed you with iRed, you couldn't do a high intensity program with iRed because you just couldn't provide enough loading. So all you were left with was, crank it up to the max and do 25 or 30 reps, because you couldn't get a load that was heavy enough that you were limited to 5 reps or 8 reps or some kind of lower range with a higher load. With the advent or the introduction of ARED, all of a sudden, now we can do that. We can prescribe heavy loads. We can prescribe low reps. Same thing was with the treadmill. We have a 2nd generation treadmill up there, which all of a sudden allows us, you can run much faster. So instead of getting on there and, kind of ambling around, doing a slow jog, now we can have people doing sprints, okay? And I don't know how much you guys know about exercise physiology, but there's a ton of literature in sports performance, and there's actually a growing literature in clinical settings with people, particularly those with chronic disease, looking at high intensity exercise, which historically and maybe intuitively seems a little dangerous. Like, do we really want someone with I don't know, that's coming out of an open heart surgery, or that has a stent, or that has COPD? Do we really want them doing high intensity exercise? Well, there's actually, not all of them, of course, but there's actually some really good literature to show that you can get some really positive clinical outcomes with higher intensity exercise. So we're like, hey, we got this new hardware now on the station. Let's try higher intensity exercise with our astronauts. And so first we tested it in bed rest, did a research study. And in space flight, what they're typically doing is they do daily aerobic exercise and they do daily resistance exercise, at least 6 days a week, some 7, but most of them, let's say 6 days a week, they're doing both, some kind of aerobic, some kind of resistance. And our idea was, hey, let's cut Let's cut resistance exercise down to 3 days a week. So we're going to lift much heavier loads for lower reps, and we're going to only lift 3 days a week instead of 6. For the aerobic side, we're still going to exercise 6 days a week, but 3 days a week, we're going to do that kind of traditional medium intensity exercise. And the other 3 days, we're going to do some kind of intervals, some kind of high intensity, sprints, or we used 30-second intervals, 2-minute intervals, and 4-minute intervals. So all pretty intense. Even the 4-minute intervals, they're pretty tough. And we tested this in bed rest. First, we did kind of a pilot study. It was a 14-day bed rest, and we had 9 guys do this program just for 2 weeks in bed rest. Let's see. They did squats on this device. They did a hamstring curl. They used a leg press. They cycled supine, and then they used our vertical treadmill. I'm going to show you a video of that. That'll be next. So this is our squat device. So we patented this, and it may seem subtle, but the big difference here is, unlike a leg press, watch her hips. That she can push her hips down. There's kind of a floating support under her hips and butt, so that she can get different hip angles than you could get, for instance, if you were just in a leg press in a sled. And I'm not going to go into the biomechanics, but joint angles matter, because that has to do with how the muscle pulls on the bone. So it has effects on both muscular adaptations, but especially on bone adaptations. And I'm not talking anything about bone tonight, but bone's another big bugaboo, is working to protect bone. This is the treadmill. The subject lays in a cradle, wearing a harness. The harness is pulling them to the treadmill surface. That was a little trick photography. So now the camera is angled at the appropriate orientation. And this is what they did. They would run on the treadmill. Forgot it. That's crooked. This looks more like probably one of their steady state runs, where they're just kind of cruising for half an hour. But then we'd have them do intervals. And I mean, they're booking it, 30-second sprints, 2-minute runs, stuff like that, to really, really increase the demand of the exercise. Here's a few data outcomes from that 14-day bed rest study. We were able to completely protect quadricep strength, calf strength, ankle plantar flexion strength, and aerobic capacity. This is VO2 max and their ventilatory threshold. So very good protection for 14 days of bed rest with this high intensity exercise program. Summary slide. All right, last couple of slides. We then took that same program to a 70-day bed rest study, and the protection was still good, but it wasn't total any longer. There still were modest, I would call them mild losses during a 70-day bed rest. So it shows, and that wasn't a surprise, but it shows us that, yeah, time matters. You can protect something for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, with a really aggressive exercise program, but if you give enough time, you're still going to see some loss. Okay. We then took the same exercise program I described, the high intensity program, which we began calling Sprint. We call it the Sprint exercise program, and we actually studied it on the space station in the astronauts. Here is an incredibly busy figure, but this was kind of a big summary figure from our findings. So this is in the space ISS study, the control group didn't not exercise. The control group did the what I'll call the old school, higher volume, lower intensity exercise program. Okay, so control did high volume, lower intensity, and then the experimental group, the Sprint group, did the high intensity, lower volume exercise program. To orient you to this graph, these are, I don't know, 8 or 10 outcomes. The bold line is the mean change. On the left is for the control. They're the straight line, and then the little squiggly line is the Sprint group, the high intensity group. And then you see the scatter. Those are individual data points. So, we had an astronaut that did as well in the control group that gained 12% in their knee extensor strength. And then we had someone that lost 18%, and you have a kind of similar spread, I guess, in the sprint group. The summary of this study was the changes were very similar in both groups, okay? And some people were like, oh, well, that's kind of disappointing. Your sprint group didn't do better. Well, they didn't do better, but in space, time is money. They spent about, I think it was about 30 or 40% less time exercising. They were spending about 6 hours a week exercising compared to 9 or 10 hours a week for the control group. So the fact that we were able to get basically equivalent outcomes with 3 or 4 hours less exercise time a week, that's important. It's also important when you think about exploration missions where you probably will have 4 astronauts in a small capsule. Well, there's only going to be one device. So you got to find time for everybody to exercise. Well, if you're doing this big, long, hour and a half, 2 hour routine, all of a sudden now your whole day is filled with people exercising one right after the other, as opposed to a much more high intensity, brief program. I think if there was anything, I think those are the main points. So this is last slide. This is kind of an idea I want to put out to you guys. So almost all these data I've showed you have been talking about percent changes in muscle strength, percent changes in muscle mass, things like that. And there's kind of an implication of, we want to have no loss. We want to send them up, and when they come back, they're just like they were when they left. And of course, that's a good aim. There's nothing wrong with that being the aspiration. It's also proved quite difficult to do. So it has us now asking the question, how much loss is too much? How much loss is okay? And we've begun doing studies to try to answer that question. And one of the ways we've tried to get at that is this idea of, if a person launches and they are hyper fit. I mean, we have, for instance, I'm thinking of one crew member who's a former Navy SEAL, excellent physical condition, very strong, does Ironman triathlons. So, I mean, he is a well-rounded, very physically fit guy. If he loses 20% strength or 20% aerobic fitness, I guarantee you, he's still going to be higher than a lot of his crewmates who might lose 0. You follow me? Because his baseline is so much higher. Even when he loses 20%, he's still higher than somebody else who started way down here and lost nothing. Okay. And by the way, that is real. All the astronauts exercise, but they're normal people. There are astronauts who are very into fitness, very into physical, nothing to do with spaceflight. They're athletes. And then you've got people that they don't really care about it, and so they're only exercising because it's part of their job and they know that they need to remain healthy and functional, but they're not killing it. And when they launch, they're a 52-year-old, middle-aged guy that's, not especially fit. Again, not horribly out of shape, but they're not stellar. Okay. So we've begun looking, kind of advancing, we call it a new paradigm, an idea of thinking of astronauts as athletes, not dissimilar from military personnel, police, fire, other group, like a warehouse worker, anyone whose job requires a level of physical fitness. Okay. And it's a mission-oriented job where it's not just like, I don't know, I'm the UPS driver, my back's hurt, so now I'm going to take 2 weeks off. It's like, no, you're an astronaut and you're on the surface of Mars, so you're going to have to figure something out. That is the job. And so this was a review paper we wrote, kind of introducing this idea of instead of just considering like, oh, well, we want to protect 100% of your strength, and if we did that, we're good. Instead, this idea of you're an athlete, we need to train you before you fly, which we do, but perhaps with a little bit more intent and a little bit more targeting. And in this study, it's the last thing that we actually modeled, and y'all have to read the paper, it's a little thick, but we modeled some mission tasks like escaping out the top hatch of a capsule, dragging a dummy, a rescue dummy that weighed, I think it weighed 160 pounds, dragging it across a mocked up Martian surface that was all kind of rough and bouncy and stuff, doing a hill climb. We mocked up all of these tasks that we think astronauts may do on Mars. And we then used a weighted suit to decondition our subjects. So we said, let's pretend I weigh 200 pounds. We said, okay, you weigh 200 pounds and you're this strong. Well, if we put 200 pounds of load on you, and we did, we had a suit that you could put weights on, like a weighted vest, but it was all over your body, legs, arms, back, chest, everywhere. Now I'm effectively half as strong as I was before. My muscles are just as strong, but now I'm moving a 400-pound me instead of a 200-pound me. And what we did is we literally had them do these tasks with the suit at different loadings. And we modeled their performance, which of course got poorer and poorer and poorer the heavier they got, i.e. the weaker. We modeled it as weakness because we modeled strength per body mass or aerobic fitness per body mass. And we were changing their body mass via this weighted suit. And we modeled the strength, the aerobic capacity, the muscle mass that was needed to do these tasks in an acceptable manner. So that's kind of where we're at now, is this idea of getting away from just trying to have a 0% loss, and instead to it's more of a fitness for duty model. It's more of an idea of, some people can afford to lose a little. Some people can afford to lose a lot. Some people need to train hard before they launch because they have no margin for error, and recognizing the demands of individual missions and not just, 0% loss. So the end. So that's kind of what we've learned over, or at least in my neck of the woods, over the last 20, 25 years. And hopefully this last bit that I was introducing here will be kind of the approach we take as we go towards Moon and Mars. You guys feel free to fire out with questions or comments or whatever y'all have. Sorry I took so long.
No, that was great. Thank you. I guess one of the questions that kind of came up, at least for me, you were mentioning that one of the astronaut cadets is a Navy SEAL, runs Ironman and all these things, and other people are not so much. And so I kind of was wondering, how come that kind of, or a level of physical fitness isn't one of the selection criteria for the astronaut?
So that's a great question. So I think the best way to answer that is kind of it's America. Okay. so at the front end, I don't remember the numbers from this last selection, because they just selected a new class a month or two ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
I was involved in the 2017 selection, 2013, 2009, a bunch of the previous. So they get I think in 17, they got 18,000 applications, and ultimately they brought, I think they have several cut downs. They brought 50 people on site. We tested them, tested their strength, tested their aerobic capacity. And I think that certainly, goes into their file. It's something for the selection panel to consider. but at the end of the day, they're looking for things a lot beyond that. Like, you're the only person in, the U.S. Navy that's flown this plane, this jet.
Mhm.
You're the only scientist that has knowledge about this. You speak a little bit of Russian and, some other obscure thing, so there's so many things they're selecting for that by just selection, you're going to get some people that are pretty good athletes, pretty good physically fit folks, and a few that aren't. I will say the trend that I've seen is towards fitter and fitter people. And I think a lot of that is just reflective of our society. I think increasingly well-educated, highly driven, ambitious people tend to also care about their fitness nowadays, in 2015, 2020, as opposed to 20 or 30, 40 years ago, where it was like military pilots drinking beer, smoking cigarettes. Hey, I can fly a jet, and they didn't care if, they didn't care about exercise because that wasn't part of the persona.
Yeah.
That was the selection part. And make a few more comments. Once they get in, they cannot make the astronauts do, like, they're supposed to exercise, and almost all of them do, but they can't make them like to the level of like, no, I want you to squat 20 pounds more. Like, you like doing light weights for 10 reps. I want you to do heavy weights for 5 reps, because they have strength coaches, They can suggest that, but if the person's like, nah, I kind of like this workout. Okay. You get, that's what they do. And so ultimately, when it's launch day, nobody's getting pulled because, they didn't work out hard enough, or they're not quite strong enough. I kind of wish it was that way. The Russians do it that way. I mean, the Russians, because I've interacted with their astronauts, I mean, they are a pawn or a cog in a machine, I mean, those guys and gals, it's like, if you don't do what we tell you, there's someone behind you that will. So, I mean, they fall in line. In America, it's just, yeah, they're a cog in the machine, but there's still some consideration of their individual preference, and nobody's gonna just kick them out of the Corps because they didn't do high intensity intervals, or something like that.
I was kind of curious because I was going to say, you mentioned there's 18,000 applicants. It's like if there's one person that's not willing to, get maybe like 20 more pounds on their squat, there's probably another person in the 18,000 that's willing to do that. And
you're right, there are, but I guess it's just not the way we end up doing it. Sometimes to my annoyance, or to our annoyance, because we're like, we have our astronauts that are our favorites. I mean, we tell them, hey, how about doing this? Oh yeah, they're run through a brick wall. And then you got others that you just know you have to treat them with kid gloves. They're like, I'll come in here, but don't push me. I'm not going to do anything super hard. And you're like, okay, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah. All right.
Could change. Now those things may affect like who gets assigned to a Mars mission, possibly. If it was perceived that their other strengths, say of a non-athlete, if their other strengths weren't perceived to outweigh that, maybe that cost them somewhere, someplace. But we never see that. We can't, all we know is, hey, we see people fly that are really fit and really good with the exercise, and we see people fly that aren't.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just quickly wanted to ask, hopefully you can hear me. I had to change my
I can.
mic. Okay, good. I just wanted to quickly ask you what you think about the ISS dropping into the ocean in 2031, because it's such an integral scientific laboratory. It's just, it seems irreplaceable. Do you think they are going to replace it? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a tough question. I mean, you've hit all the relevant points, which is, okay, there's a lot of money been invested in it. It is certainly highly valuable, in that it affords us the ability to do things that you can't do elsewhere. At the same time, it costs a lot of money to upkeep. and I'm not an engineer, but my understanding is, it's no different than a car, I guess, that gets older and it costs more money to upkeep it. And at some point you're starting to worry like something big's gonna fall off or blow up or something like that. And it could actually, be really serious, problematic. Also going back to the money side of things, the way NASA has usually done stuff is they tend to kind of pour their money not in a entirely in a single direction, but let's say largely in a single direction. And as Moon and Mars, and I think very appropriately, Moon and Mars begin rising to the forefront and more money is diverted that way, ISS will just get less and less money. And at some point they'll just say, we cannot responsibly continue this. And that'll be, what they'll do. So it is kind of a shame. I've read books, it was before my time, but I've read books about Mir, the Russian space station from the 90s, splashing down, and that sucks. And I've thought about people that, that have probably spent their entire career, working on ISS. And that's a tough pill to swallow, but, it's probably one of those just hard necessities. It'd be nice if you could keep it going, but probably won't. It's been, I feel like its original life was no later than 2024. It may have even been earlier than 2024, but I think it was 2024. It's been extended to 28 and now to 31. So at some point they actually adhere to their deadline and they're like, okay, that's going to be it. So yeah, good question.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay, and then I recently, first of all, thank you so much for presenting.
Oh, absolutely.
A few people had to head out, but they wanted to say thank you as well. But
Sure, thanks.
I recently read a publication that talked about a pill that was able to stimulate the effects. This one was specific for endurance exercise. Do
Yeah.
you think anything similar would ever be implemented, like for astronauts or space travel?
That's a really good question. I actually found that paper that, because it was in the questions you sent me. I didn't read the whole paper, but I kind of glanced at the abstract. So I don't have any deep familiarity with sorry guys, with exercise mimetics, but I know what they are. I think that there will absolutely be, and I know that there absolutely is interest in stuff like that, especially with Mars missions, with using pharmacologic, which I would put this in that category, pharmacologic and or nutritional supplements or adjuncts to try to either boost the effectiveness of exercise or to allow us to, have a smaller exercise device, let's say, that doesn't provide as much loading, but because you're taking this, this mimetic, you're back where you need to be, that kind of thing. So that's a pretty thin answer, but yes, I do think that there is interest in them. I actually reviewed a paper last year that they were proposing. They didn't have it down to like, here's how to do it, but they were proposing the idea, and I forget the phrase they used, but I'll use my own phrase. It was basically putting people in quasi hibernation on a Mars flight, like putting them in a depressed metabolic state, like squirrels or bears or so. I think the idea was it wouldn't be so low that they were completely like unconscious, but it would be a way to slow their, and they just presented a lot of data, mostly animal data, saying it can be done, we ought to look at this. And the idea there is simply to save food mass, because that's a challenge. Going to Mars is you're going to eat a lot of food on the way, and if you could decrease your crew members' metabolic rates, then you're saving on that.
Okay, yeah, I think that clears things up a lot, but Yeah, they're still pretty far away, even in the paper. They could get it to have an effect genetically, but not phenotypically. So
Yeah,
still,
yeah,
yeah, still a long way away, but it was just interesting
yeah,
to see how that was being implemented.
yeah, yeah. No, it's really cool stuff. That's one of the, in my PhD, I did a lot of not exercise mimetics, but a lot of more like molecular cellular stuff with bed rest. You know, it was spaceflight related, but in this case, we're trying to, prevent changes in muscle. I mean, we were specifically evaluating things at the cellular and the molecular level. And what we often would see is, I'll call it a disconnect between the cellular molecular level and what was happening phenotypically out at the, the whole body level, which is to say, a lot of times you could turn things on or off down at that, at that finer level, but then when you measured change in strength or change in muscle mass, it wasn't doing anything, So yeah, you got to start somewhere, but ultimately, an astronaut on mission, it doesn't matter if their PGC1 alpha activity is increased. What matters is, do they still have muscle strength? So you got to protect that phenotypic functional outcome.
I got a quick question. So you're mentioning nutrition a bit earlier, and so I know conservation of muscle mass is something we're talking about, and bone health. So what kind of considerations are given for diet in order to kind of supplement and preserve those things? I mean, we were talking to some other people earlier on. They were talking about, the astronauts get to choose what kind of food that they take. Sometimes it might be a cheeseburger, XYZ, and it doesn't sound very good for preserving muscle health. But what's it like?
It's, well, again, on that kind of this is America topic. I mean, they do get to select. It's monitored, but they have a lot of freedom to select, both select on the ground, like these are my food preferences, but then when they get up there, I mean, there's still some choice. They can kind of avoid some things and eat more of others. The mean values always look pretty good. Like, okay, because I would say the two biggest things you need in spaceflight, number one, by far, you need enough energy, enough calories. Unlike here on Earth, there seems to be just something about spaceflight. It could be the food, it could be truly the environment, it could be the lack of ambulation, who knows. But in general, people, voluntarily, I'm sure subconsciously, they reduce their caloric intake. So getting, and there's a lot of data to show that if you can keep caloric intake, even, like we call it neutral energy balance, muscle will fare a lot better. So you get in a caloric deficit long term, chronically, you're going to lose muscle in spaceflight. And then the second thing that's most important is protein intake. When you look at the mean values, they seem pretty good. They're usually reported somewhere in the like 1.2. I think one study had as high as like 1.4 grams of protein per kilo per day, which is, you'd think, well, that's not so bad. A lot of research, though, and some of what I did, especially in my PhD, has shown, looking in older adults, hospitalized adults, and astronauts, bed rest type things, more protein is needed to protect muscle. And so those, number one, those 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, that may still not be enough, number one. The other thing we looked at, it's a little side thing, is we looked at protein distribution through the day. So without discussing studies, it is important that you don't eat, a granola bar for breakfast, a salad for lunch, and then you have a 16-ounce T-bone steak for dinner. Your total protein intake will look good, look appropriate. but you're getting most or all of it at one meal. So you're only getting one big anabolic stimulus for muscle protein synthesis per day, as opposed to if you had, had some eggs and yogurt for breakfast and you'd had, some chicken on that salad, and now you eat maybe a 6-ounce steak instead of a 16-ounce steak at dinner. So same protein intake, but you spread it, and you've gotten 3 distinct stimuli from your meals.
Gotcha.
That has not been tracked or studied at all in spaceflight.
Okay.
So me, and of course it's my bias from where I sit and the research I do and know, I'm like, I really wish that they would look at that. I really wish they'd try to affect that. But the nutrition lab, it's called the Nutrition and Biochemistry Lab. They tend to focus a lot on micronutrients, biochemistry. They look a lot at they work a lot with the bone lab to look at markers of bone degradation. So, and I'm friends with them. We're colleagues, we talk and everything, but they're not as interested in what I view as, and I'm an exercise physiologist, but what I would view as like the meat and potatoes, like the mainstream nutrition stuff. They're doing like the cool niche stuff. Like, what about vitamin K and vitamin D supplementation, and what is that doing to, bone reabsorption and, things like that, as opposed to
The bigger picture.
what about protein intake patterns, and like big stuff.
Yeah, that's fair. And I guess another thing that kind of popped up is you're mentioning kind of long-term space travel, and we have all these psychological associations with food. So if you're stuck in a soup can basically for a few months, maybe eating a granola bar and salads every day to keep your protein intake up might not be the psychologically the best. So you guys make concessions for unhealthy food.
Yep.
So, great.
You got it.
So it's 7:45. Do you guys have any other questions?
I don't see anybody with their hand raised or anything. I just want to say thank you, Dr. English.
Absolutely.
We are a big fan of, we had Dr. Scott come in, Dr. Poltzider.
Cool.
We had Mrs. I didn't realize there was a Mr. Until I took a closer look.
Yeah.
But yeah,
They're a really cool. They're a really cool couple, by the way. They're very, very cool.
I know that's a power couple. That's two. Yeah. But yeah,
he was actually on my Rob Plotz. He was actually on my dissertation committee. He is a statistical whiz. I mean, he's a statistician, is what he is, and he helped me a lot. He's a really cool guy. So, sorry, I interrupted.
No. I mean, it was me thanking you. So anyway, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Quite a few comments in the chat. Just very thankful for your time tonight. Well, not tonight for you, but
the night is young. Awesome, guys. Well, I really appreciate y'all inviting me. And if you have any questions or need any, any info about anything, feel free to email me, look me up. By the way, if you do look me up, I actually have accepted a position at another university in Tennessee. So as of when will it be? August, I think, late August. I'll be at another university. I'm sure if you Google me, you can find me. But if you're all of a sudden like, whoa, he's not at University of Houston Clear Lake anymore, that is true. I'm switching. My wife's from Tennessee, so we're trying to head up, be by her parents for a few years.
Well, congratulations. Still
Thank
on
you
the
very
top,
I've heard good things.
Yeah. I'm just as reachable.
All right. Well, I'm gonna end the recording, but thank you all so much for
Awesome.
being here. Thank you again.
Yes,
Y'all
thank
too.
you.
Best of wishes. Y'all take care. Bye-bye.